Welcome to the Period Story Podcast, the podcast where we get behind some of the myths and misconceptions about periods. We chat with women about their period story, their first period, their journey ever since, and we open up a conversation to help break taboos and stigmas around menstruation. I'm your host, Lanice Brothers. I'm a yoga teacher and registered nutritionist specializing in women's health, hormones, and the menstrual cycle. I'm also the author of You Can Have a Better Period, the book Publishers Weekly calls an empowering debut, an informative, refreshing take on women's health. It's available from Amazon, Bookshop, and anywhere else you purchase books. I'm so pleased to share my conversation with Katie Taylor, who's the founder of the Latte Lounge. Katie so honestly shares her experience of perimenopause and menopause and her entire menstrual journey, from a very painful experience of having a period to having hysterectomy and everything between. Hi, Katie. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I'm really excited to speak to you and hear your story. So let's kick off by talking about the story of your very first period.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, firstly. Obviously, it's a pleasure to be here. So the story of my first period, it's a funny one. I actually was the last in my class, and I hated that. I actually thought there was something wrong with me because everyone else had sort of had their periods by the time they were about 13, and I was desperate to have it. And I think it was literally probably about the day before my 14th birthday that I finally had my period. But there's a funny story actually, because just when I turned 13, I remember I'd been in a art class at school, and there was lots of paintings that were hanging up to dry and everything, and I'd obviously brushed past very quickly one of these paintings, and when I got home, I remember sort of taking off my skirt from school, and there was red and brown paint all over the bottom of my skirt, and I thought I'd started my period, and I was like, oh, it's fantastic, and I was like, Mom, I've started my period, and she's like, no, you haven't. That's paint. I was really disappointed. And then I had to wait almost a year.
Wow. So in the end, how old were you? About 14?
It was just literally probably a couple of days before I turned 14. So I did feel really old compared to my kind of classmates.
And then how did you learn about what was happening to you?
Well, I think I learned about periods mainly from my friends, and also, because watching them go through it, and they were all sort of saying how they felt. And so I think because I was pretty much the last in my class, I already had it sort of expected, because they were talking about pain. So I'd expected to be in pain, moody. I had, my mum always, her moods were kind of up and down as well. So I just assumed that's kind of how I would feel. But I did, I suppose I also learned from watching, TV ads or in magazines about sanitary products that were advertised. And obviously we learned about it at school, but it wasn't something I took that much notice about at school. I would say it was more from my social, crowd.
And when you think back about some of the things your friends may have told you, or some of the things that you saw, is there anything that you were surprised by, or that you kind of shake your head and just think, oh, wow, that was just so naive?
I think it was just more that they were all sort of saying how much pain they were in and trying to get off. We always had to go swimming. It was one of the local swimming baths, and it was always freezing and dark and horrible. I absolutely hated it. And so they always sort of, tried to get out of swimming and get their mums to write letters. And I was desperate because I absolutely hated going swimming. So I was like, I actually wanted to get my period just so I could get out of swimming. But I guess nothing they said, I suppose, can ever really prepare you. But I don't think it was quite as bad. I think there was a lot of hysteria when, as a class sort of group, everybody was comparing notes.
That's so interesting, because I spoke to someone recently and she said that no one talked about it. They all wanted to get it, but then once they got it, no one talked about their periods. None of her friend group compared notes like you mentioned. So it's just so interesting just to see the different ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
When you think back to the conversations that you used to have about it with your friends, was there a kind of feeling of excitement tinged with like, well, we need to kind of get off swimming, or was there any kind of shame intermixed in the conversation?
I don't think it was shame. I think there was a lot of embarrassment because I was in a mixed school, and, it's the same time when your hormones hit and you're also suddenly taking a real interest in boys and going to parties. So I think there was a lot of embarrassment there. And I'm also grew up, I'm Jewish, and I grew up in a Jewish family, modern Orthodox Jewish family. But I think in our religion, a lot of women are sort of brought up to just be real copers and just to get on with it and not to make a fuss. So I think it was different, but I've also grown up in a very medical family. So my dad is one of 5, and they're all professors and doctors. And a lot of my father's a breast cancer professor, although he's retired. So a lot of the conversations around our dinner table were always about women's health. So for me, it was okay. I didn't feel embarrassment or shame because I was fascinated by sort of human biology and the female anatomy, just because it was such a common topic of conversation in our house. So I was more interested in what was happening and why. And I asked a lot of questions, not so much to my father, because yes, it's still embarrassing to talk about, bleeding at the dinner table. It's just not. It's not the done thing. But I was more interested in what was going on, but also wanted to be sure that, if I was going to a party, that I was, I wasn't going to leak. Basically, that's always your biggest worry is, making sure you've got sanitary towels with you and whatever.
What's really interesting is what you said about growing up in a Jewish family, and something that I was reading about when I was doing the research for my book was the mikveh. Please correct my pronunciation, and the purification baths, and how there's a lot of Jewish women now who are kind of reinventing what that means and like using it as a kind of time where they can kind of settle into their bleed, and using it as a moment of self-care rather than like, you have to purify yourself because you're bleeding and that's dirty. And I found that so fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, look, the very religious Jewish community, that's absolutely right. That intercourse doesn't happen during women's period, and these very, religious families, that they'll often sleep in separate beds, and they go after they've had after their period is finished, they'll go to the mikveh. So for those who are listening, it's almost sort of like dipping into a bath of water, and coming out, as you say, as purified. And I think for people listening, they might think, well, that's a kind of weird thing to do, because, bleeding isn't, unpure. It's just a natural biology. But it's not, obviously, I'm not a religious Jew. I'm just a sort of modern Orthodox Jew. So it was something I'd heard growing up, but it wasn't something that particularly affected me.
Okay, that's interesting. You grew up having these really open conversations about women's health. And so did you feel like once you got your period, you were maybe a bit ahead of the game in terms of your understanding of your body and what was happening? And then just out of curiosity, because sometimes what I've seen in in conversations with other guests who come from a background where there's medicine or something like that, they take on a kind of like teacher role with their friends. Did something similar happen to you?
I mean, as a teenager, not so much. I kind of was curious, but obviously, I suffered with my periods. I had terrible, terrible pain, terrible headaches. My moods were awful. I had awful acne. So to be honest, and I felt very angry. The periods weren't a joyful time for me, and I couldn't wait for them to be over. So I always sort of felt like I was almost sort of just trying to sort of survive those 5 days before almost coming back to normal. But in terms of sort of talking about it, I felt at the time that I knew everything I needed to know. It's only now, and obviously we'll talk about what I do a bit later, but it's only now I know what I know that I realize how little I knew actually about, women's health and periods and hormones and how they can affect you post school.
And you talked about feeling very angry when you had your period because of the pain, the headaches, the acne. What did you do about it?
Well, I mean, I used to take, obviously, pain relief, and my mum always used to give me a hot water bottle, and I'd sort of curl up, under the covers. And I just really just felt very unhappy and miserable. But, but I guess because I was a doctor's daughter, I was never allowed a day off school. I had to be seriously unwell for that. So you just kind of got on with it, really. It wasn't, anything more than that. And because everyone else was obviously in the same boat, I was no different from anyone else.
And then once you moved into your 20s and your 30s, what was your experience of your period like then?
Yeah, and this is kind of why I wish I'd sort of known a bit more than what I know now. So I got married very young. I was 24, and we tried to start for a family, and I found it quite difficult to get pregnant at first, but I managed to get pregnant, and then unfortunately I had a miscarriage. And after the miscarriage, I noticed I was spotting. It was sort of some brown spotting. I thought perhaps it was just a period, but so I didn't really know that actually it was a miscarriage. And after the miscarriage, again, I found it quite hard to get pregnant. And so I was sent to a gynecologist to just have some tests and scans. And they said then that I had polycystic ovaries, which kind of it was a bit of one of many light bulb moments I've had since, because it was the reason why my periods were sort of so painful and a little bit erratic, because they weren't always, classic 5-day periods like most people. And so she actually started me on Clomid, which helped regulate my periods. I had, by the way, been on the contraceptive pill up until then. So that actually did help my moods a bit and regulate my periods before I was starting for a baby. And I then managed to get, pregnant fairly easily. And actually, I went on to have 4 pregnancies, thank God. I'm delighted to say. Sadly, they were all via cesarean section because they lost the heartbeat of my first baby, and it was an emergency. And after that, I couldn't I couldn't give birth naturally. So that was kind of my, I suppose, initial experience. And then in terms of sort of post having my babies, really that kind of takes us up to, my early 40s. I had one very bad experience before my sort of perimenopause journey kicked in, which was one night I'd been to a party at my husband's work do, and I was on my period. And I had got in very, very late, probably like 3 in the morning. And I had woke up and thought, I must change, my tampon. And I thought, I didn't put a tampon in. So I put a tampon in and carried on with my day. And the next night, I started feeling very, very unwell to a point where I was shivering and burning hot. And my husband had to call an ambulance. I've never been in an ambulance. And it turned out that I'd had the string had snapped off this tampon. So I'd obviously put another one in. And I had septicemia from a retained tampon, basically, which was really terrifying. And I ended up in hospital for about 10 days, just sort of on a intravenous antibiotics. I mean, thankfully, I'm here to tell the tale, but it was a very scary time. And I don't want people to be scared about tampons. It was one of those just rare things that doesn't happen, but I think it really scared me at the time.
Wow, that's so scary. Because, when you're growing up, you hear about toxic shock syndrome. And, that's one of those things, don't leave your tampon in for too long.
Yeah.
But then to hear that actually happened to you. Wow. And then when you came out of the hospital, how did you then feel about your next period? Did you use tampons again?
I've never used them again. I was absolutely terrified. But the interesting thing was the timing kind of coincided with my perimenopause journey. So I was becoming very forgetful. So although the string had snapped off, I still to this day think, could I just not feel it or find it, or was I just very forgetful? It was hugely embarrassing as well, to tell people that that's how I'd caught septicemia. But I was too frightened to ever use tampon again. And then what happened was I noticed my periods became incredibly irregular. And I started to feel, by the age of about 43, a whole host of seemingly unrelated symptoms. So very teary, low mood, brain fog, anxiety. I had heart palpitations. My joints were aching. I didn't have any hot flushes. And as I said, I was still having periods, but I kept going back and forwards to different doctors over a 4-year period. And every time they kept saying I was suffering with depression, and they offered me antidepressants. And eventually my period started becoming incredibly heavy to a point where I was flooding. I literally couldn't leave the house and if I was wearing some white trousers, well, that was just horrendous because there was no warning and I would just flood. And I became incredibly anemic. Doctors sort of offered me things like tranexamic acid, I think it's called.
Tranexamic acid.
Yeah, tranexamic acid. Tablets that didn't help. And I just became a shell of a woman. I eventually left my job and I became a hermit, and I lay at home basically exhausted all day on the couch. And at no point did anyone offer me any other solution other than to antidepressants. It turned out I had a condition called adenomyosis. I had a lot of scar tissue from my cesarean sections, and they couldn't give me a coil because of these cesarean sections. Because of the scar tissue. Eventually, my dad was the one that said, look, I think this is hormones. And he sent me to see a gynecologist who specialized in the menopause. And within about half an hour of me telling her about all of my different symptoms, she said, this is classic perimenopause. It was another light bulb moment. I'd never heard of this word, but I just felt relieved I wasn't going mad or I wasn't being a hypochondriac, and B, that there was a reason for these symptoms. And for me, the treatment option was hormone replacement therapy. And I just went home and sort of cried with relief on my bed that, there was actually a reason why I was feeling like I was feeling. And that's why I set up the work I do now. So, in some ways, I'm quite grateful for that experience.
Yeah, wow. I mean, there's so much in that story that you just shared. Thank you so much for sharing your story. So you had 4 cesarean sections. And then prior to having the cesarean sections, you were on the pill that was controlling the pain. You were kind of having a withdrawal bleed, and then you came off the pill. Were the 4 pregnancies, were they in succession? I can never say that word, succession.
Yeah, I mean, I had my children quite close together. There's 7 years between the oldest and the youngest, and there's 4 of them. So they're pretty much sort of every couple of years. I just wanted to kind of get on with it. And I've always wanted a big family. My husband's one of 4, and obviously my dad's one of 5. So it was a planned madness.
After having each pregnancy, would you go back on the pill to control the pain?
I went back on the pill after each pregnancy until the very last one, where my doctor said to me, are you finished with your family? And I said, yes, absolutely. I'm very blessed. And I was actually, because I'd had a cesarean, they offered to, if I wanted to have my tubes tied, to help with obviously the contraception. And I think because I wouldn't have probably done it had I not been, I suppose, already cut open. But he offered to do it at the time of the cesarean, and because I was blessed to have had 4 healthy children, I just decided that's something I wanted to do. So yeah.
Okay, so you had your tubes tied, and then so how old were you at this point?
So my daughter, I was 28, so I think I was about 35 when I had my last child. So mid-30s. And
then you mentioned that you were around 43 when you started to experience the brain fog and the forgetfulness. So you basically, you had your tubes tied. I can't remember what the formal medical term is.
I think it's something like tubular ligation or something.
Yeah, tubal ligation. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah. And so how was your experience of your period in that time between having your tubes tied and then that time where you went to your doctor, or so you went to the hospital?
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a sort of calmer time then, because things were, pretty regular, sort of monthly and regular, although they were never, 5 days. They were usually about sort of 4 days or so. I mean, the pain was still the pain, really. It didn't really change, and the mood swings were still the mood swings. Yeah.
And so your periods were still very, very painful.
Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting that they hadn't diagnosed the adenomyosis until your mid-40s. And you mentioned the scar tissue. So it just makes me think of Asherman syndrome as well, which is actually quite connected to adenomyosis. So for listeners who aren't familiar, it's where the tissue cells that should ordinarily be within the womb, within the uterus that, we shed during menstruation, they actually within the muscular lining of the uterus. And it makes periods incredibly, incredibly painful and heavy. And so then you started to experience these symptoms of perimenopause, and you had this light bulb moment when you went to your doctor, and then you were put on HRT.
Yeah, my periods never sort of came up as part of that conversation. Nobody really ever asked me about them, so which I still to this day find quite surprising. They were focusing just more on the mental health side of things, my mood and why I was crying and why I was low. And they commented on, well, you're overweight, or perhaps you need to, get fit, that kind of thing. But there was, I even went to see a psychiatrist who told me that my aching joints, I was just imagining it, and it was all in my head. And that was all part of the depressive illness. I know it was really, really shocking. I felt very dismissed. I was made to feel like a hypochondriac, and it's crazy because I think growing up, as I said, in a doctor's sort of family, I never complained about my health. I'm very calm. I actually like being around a medical environment, because it's just something I'm grown up with, following my dad around on ward rounds or whatever. So I felt really quite angry that I wasn't taken seriously. But then, I just sort of thought, well, actually, I'm just going to hide away at home because I can't keep complaining to my friends. I have a really good life and I'm just embarrassed that I'm not coping.
It's shocking, but it's not shocking that you were dismissed in that way, because I hear it so often. And I'm so sorry that you had that experience. When you think back, knowing what you know now, when you think back to your experiences of perimenopause isn't a diagnosis, but, actually just hearing that word and then going on the HRT, what do you wish you could have said to yourself? What do you wish, you could have said to your doctors?
Well, it's something that I now tell all the women who I help in our community. So when I got home from my own diagnosis, I set up a Facebook group and I called it the Latte Lounge because I wanted it to feel like a sort of a coffee shop, but online, where women could talk about their own, not just perimenopause and menopause, but all sort of their midlife health and well-being concerns. And one of the things I've created is a downloadable symptom checklist. It's free for anyone who wants to get hold of it. And I had no idea that there were so many. I mean, there are up to probably 50. Our symptom checklist has 34 of the sort of most common symptoms. And I think I just wish that I had learnt about at school that, not just about menopause, but this perimenopause section, because we learn about not getting pregnant, or we learn about periods, or we learn about having babies. And then your education stops and you don't know anything. And you sort of have heard of that word menopause, but in your mind, that's just some grey-haired old lady who's got a hot flush and she's sort of fanning herself and rocking in a corner. And I think so I wish I had been taught at school, and I wish I'd been shown this sort of symptom checklist, because the symptoms are not dissimilar to some of the symptoms you suffer, when you have periods. So again, the low mood, heart palpitations, anxiety, that kind of thing. But the other thing that I obviously found out, now I've been working in this field for sort of 6-7 years, is that there is no mandatory menopause training at medical school. So doctors are coming out with a very sort of scanty knowledge, especially about this perimenopause, which can often be 10 years before the menopause. So I just kind of wish that there was a lot more training at medical school, that we were taught about it at school. I talk about it nonstop to my daughter and to all of my 3 sons as well, because I think we need to be that generation that are going to not just educate ourselves, but the younger generation. And so I just think it's about being informed, because information and knowledge is power. And I think the more we can all learn about this next phase of our life and go informed to a doctor's appointments, that the quicker we'll all get diagnosed and hopefully treated.
You mentioned you have these conversations with your daughter and with your sons. Do you talk, is it about periods? Is it just generally about health? I'm interested in the conversations with your sons, because I think that is it's obviously important that we talk to our daughters about this and have open and honest conversations with them. But I do think there is really something about bringing in boys to the conversation. I have a 9-year-old son, and his school he's about to go into a mixed school. And I said to him, you're at the age where some girls, they might get their periods, and they might get their periods in school. And so if you see a girl, if maybe she has a stain on the back of her skirt or her dress, just offer your jumper to them, so they don't feel embarrassed. Just be really nice about this. And he looked a bit confused, like obviously he had never thought about it. But I really want to kind of plant those seeds early on. And he knows all about periods because he hears me talking about them all the time. He's in the other room and I'm talking about all of this stuff, so he just knows. But I don't think he had ever thought about it in the context of his life and like his soon to be classmate. So I think that's really interesting. So I'm just interested in your conversations with your sons.
Yeah, well, I guess it's a bit like you. My kids are so used to hearing me talk about perimenopause and menopause all the time. It's almost like, they're rolling their eyes going, oh, here she goes again, So, but the good thing is they are informed. And one of the things I didn't mention was I actually ended up having to have a hysterectomy. So what happened was my womb became so bulky and it was stopping the blood flowing to my ankle, well, to my feet. So my ankles were swollen. So I had to have a hysterectomy. And once I got better from the hysterectomy, I remember it was about 8 weeks later and I had to go to a family party, and I was sitting next to one of my male cousins who I love dearly, and we're a very, very close family. And he sort of turned to me and he said, "How are you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm okay. I've been in hospital. I had to have an operation." And he went, "Oh, what was wrong?" And I said, "Oh, I had a hysterectomy." Now I'm so used to just sort of throwing these words out there. Well, his response really shocked me, and he went, "Whoa," like that, like literally, "Whoa, too much information." He sort of recoiled, and I was like, oh my God, wow, okay. I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. And he immediately was all very awkward and sort of, I had to sort of try and make him feel better. And I sort of dropped a napkin on the floor and I went, oh, I'm just going to pick up my napkin. And I went home that night, and afterwards I was thought, my goodness, that generation of men where there's still that, women really shouldn't, it's disgusting and don't talk about that sort of thing. So I've sort of, ever since that experience, I've been a bit like you. I've said to my boys, look, women have been ridiculed for as long as I can remember. Men are like, oh God, she's on her period, or oh, you're so moody, you're on your period, or oh, it's your hormones, oh, you're menopausal today, and oh God, don't go near her. And I hate that, because actually, we can't help it. It is our hormones, and none of us want to be miserable or moody. So I've sort of brought my boys up, especially in the last sort of decade, to actually sort of say that, men and women are very different. We are, to some extent sort of dictated by our hormones. And, we're women, unlike men, every month our moods are going to be affected. And it's about being understanding and supportive. So I think if men and boys are taught about why we are like we are, that they could be sort of much more empathetic and understanding. And also, it saves relationships and marriages, because a lot of women I hear from in the Latte Lounge, the most common rate of divorce is 45 to 55. And sadly, suicide is highest in women during 45 to 55. And that's because, some women do suffer very, very badly and get to a very, very dark place. And, you often hear from men saying, I don't recognize my wife, like my husband didn't recognize me. You can literally change personalities and become a very different person. And I think the more that we teach boys and men to understand and be, empathetic and supportive, and also to go with your partner, perhaps to a doctor's appointment, to say, how can I help? I think would be a lot happier if, and it's important that men and boys are, educated and brought up in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you had a hysterectomy. Was this after you started the HRT? Okay, so you had already been using the HRT to manage some of the perimenopausal symptoms that you've been experiencing, and then you had the hysterectomy. Was it a full or partial hysterectomy?
It was a full hysterectomy, because by that point I was just flooding so much. They couldn't control the bleeding. We'd tried all sorts of different things. And then once my legs started swelling, we'd sort of felt like we'd pretty much tried and thrown everything at it. So yeah, it was a full hysterectomy. And, thankfully I had started HRT before, but there's a lot of women who have to have hysterectomies, either perhaps through, for medical reasons or because of, menopause symptoms. And when they remove the ovaries, you're plunged into menopause immediately. And there's a lot of women who are not counseled about that, and they and are not even offered HRT. And for those who are listening who might not know, and I just think it's vitally important that anyone that's been told they have to have a hysterectomy, that they have the conversations about what may happen hormonally to them afterwards, and the HRT is part of that conversation.
And so you had the hysterectomy, you were on HRT, and then did you have to go on a different form of HRT after the hysterectomy? What was your experience like? So you went into medical menopause, and obviously that's quite a shocking experience as you've described. How supported did you feel with your doctors navigating that new experience?
Well, I think by that point, because I was under a really good gynecologist and I knew then, what was going on and what to expect and what to ask for. So I knew I only needed to be on estrogen then. So all we did was we just stopped the progesterone. So I used to be on a combination patch, but that, after then I only needed the estrogen. And so, look, I mean, looking back now, it's actually the best thing I ever did, because I'm relieved to no longer have that horrible flooding and periods. And for a while, it was a bit weird because you always sort of know where you are with your period. So to suddenly, for the first time in your life, never have them, it's kind of a strange thing. But I think, for those that, perhaps haven't finished their family, it can be devastating. But for me, I just looked at all my blessings and that I was so lucky to have 4 healthy children. And actually it was a relief not to, have any more periods. And also, I'd become severely anemic.
Well, if you don't mind me asking, because we've kind of put together a timeline, which I always find fascinating to do, because it helps others who might be experiencing something similar understand, maybe have like a reference point for their journeys. How old are you now?
So I'm 53 now,
okay.
But the whole sort of perimenopause journey started at 43. So
right.
Yeah, I feel like I've been on quite a journey.
Yeah, definitely. And so if anyone's listening who isn't sure what perimenopause is it's something that can start in the late 30s and is a very natural part of the kind of menstrual reproductive life cycle, where you just you stop producing as many mature eggs, and then that has an impact on progesterone production. And then eventually there are different phases of perimenopause. And then this eventually leads into menopause, which is actually just the very last period. And let's now talk about the Latte Lounge. So you had this experience, you went home, you set up your Facebook group, which I think is fantastic, because you had this very disempowering experience. And then you said, actually, I'm going to go out and help others. I don't want others to feel how I feel now. So tell us more about the Latte Lounge.
Yeah, so absolutely. So the Facebook group grew very organically. The first night I set it up, I had 1,000 member requests in 24 hours. And I was like, my goodness, okay, I'm not alone. This is, this is going on all over the place. I was shocked at how poorly women were informed and belittled and confused and lost and treated pretty badly. And I think because I'm a doctor's daughter, I thought I can't just let these women dump their problems into a Facebook group and just try and figure it out from other very well-meaning women. I need to actually help them properly. So I put together a medical advisory team and I built a website to really with 3 key aims, which are to support, inform, and signpost women to the right resources or people or places, so that whatever they come to us about, we will do whatever we can to support them. And I think, because we're the sandwich generation, we're often juggling children, we're perhaps aging parents, we've got relationships going on and looking after our own work and home and life and sort of well-being. Nobody really shines the spotlight on us, the women in the middle. And, we have this sort of pressure cooker situation going on. So I just wanted to kind of be that place where, often in the middle of the night when women perhaps are not sleeping well, or they're worried, or they just have a sort of very quick question, that we kind of capture those problems and we try and help them, and be that through our podcast or through our articles on our website. I also run an event called the Midlife Festival, which is an annual event where we bring together some of the world leading not just menopause and perimenopause experts, but all women's health and well-being experts, talking about nutrition and fitness and things like breast cancer and heart health, and just so that women can learn from themselves in a very easy fashion, from home, and, not be scared by sort of some really complicated medical terminology, but just where the sort of the facts are explained. So, we do that, and we have a very small private membership as well for women who want a lot more hand-holding, and we'll run masterclasses there. And again, I'll help them behind the scenes, so that you can just really sort of feel the best we can feel, and then, embrace life and enjoy this next stage, really.
Yeah. What I feel so excited and enthused about is this new thinking about moving into 40s, 50s, and 60s. I think about when I was a teenager, and how, the 60s was thinking about being in your 60s. There's this stereotype of women just on the decline, having a short haircut, maybe, it was curled, skin just very, looking very dehydrated. There's this real stereotype. And you think now, all the amazing women in the public eye who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, who just look so vital, they have this vitality about them. And I think it's so amazing. I'm 43. And so I know that I'm, in the kind of early stages of perimenopause. I'm in denial at the moment. But this term midlife, I just want to ask you about it, because it's something that I'm seeing a lot at the moment. And I struggle with that a little bit on a personal level, because I think of myself, I'm 43. I don't think of myself as being a midlife woman, but then I look at the sign behind you. It says Latte Lounge, top tips for women over 40. It's a virtual coffee shop for all midlife women. And I'm like, oh, well, have I been midlife? But I don't feel like that at all.
Yeah, I think it is a funny word. I think it's, hopefully we're all living longer, thankfully. And that's because, leaps and bounds have been made in science and medicine. But I think, you touched on women looking so much more vibrant than perhaps the image we were brought up to believe, that women are old and grey and knackered and finished. But we're living longer, we're working longer. And I think a lot of the work I do is campaigning as well. So I've been campaigning for the last sort of 5 years with the Make Menopause Matter campaign with a lovely lady called Diane Danzibrink. And what's happened is, because we've been sort of, I guess social media has been a force for good in this situation. I think because a lot of us have gone through these experiences. Diane was suicidal with her situation, and it's driven us to all campaign and talk very openly. And so with things like the Davina McCall program and lots of doctors and women coming to social media or writing books, I think we're all openly talking about our experiences, because we can, through the beauty of things like social media, and because we don't feel old. I think, our parents really didn't learn much about nutrition and exercise and looking after ourselves, whereas we've been brought up, this next generation, we're learning to how to eat, to optimize our diet and look and feel great. We know the importance of exercise for long-term health and well-being, and we enjoy it. So, why should we be sort of sitting in the corner, rocking in that chair? We want to I still feel young. In fact, I feel better now than I did in my 30s. In my 30s, I was shattered all the time because I had 4 kids, whereas now I feel happy and vibrant and excited and full of life and really, like I found my purpose. And I just want women to feel, I guess, as well as you look and as well as I feel. And that all comes down to just, being informed and, life is for living. And I've lost, sadly, a few friends over recent years who didn't have that luxury. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm praying I'm in midlife. I pray that I will, live till 106 and you well past 46. Sorry, 86 or...
Yeah, I hope so too. So someone listening to this is thinking, okay, I know that I am, I've started perimenopause, and that, menopause is on the horizon. What would you say to them as a kind of some words of support?
Yeah, I mean, don't be scared or afraid of it. There are many women who sail through it, and that's absolutely fabulous. But just, as I say, be informed now so that if perhaps you do start noticing, as you sort of turn 40, that you start to experience perhaps some brain fog or low mood or, even things like dry, itchy skin or these sort of anxiety, heart palpitations, that actually, it's worth just sort of putting 2 and 2 together early on and thinking, okay, I am going into perimenopause. And if you're not coping, if it's affecting your life like it did mine, don't suffer in silence. There is no one's going to give you a medal just for coping. And actually there are, for those that can go on HRT and want to, and I understand there's a whole group of women who perhaps can't because of a family history or they've had breast cancer, but go and see a menopause specialist because a lot of women still can, even with a family history. But be informed. And, HRT, for those that can take it, prevents osteoporosis, it reduces heart disease, and there's research going on at the moment that it can help with things like early onset dementia. There's not enough evidence yet, but, it is being looked at. So there are long-term health benefits. So don't be frightened of it, and don't feel like, you get some sort of medal for, I'm just going to try my best to manage. If you're not coping, then go and, seek some support. And everyone's welcome to join our Facebook group. It's free, and look on our website. And, we will support and signpost you if you do need help. So, yeah.
And where can people find you?
The website is lattelounge.co.uk, and through the website, you'll be able to find everything else. The Midlife Festival is themidlifefestival.com as well. If you want to, grab one of the VIP passes, you can watch back the last 2 years of fabulous experts and the podcast. If you just search for the Latte Lounge, you'll find it there.
Fantastic. Is there anything that you want to leave listeners with? Any last words? Any last thoughts?
Well, the only other thing I haven't mentioned is that I left my job because of my symptoms. And if you're struggling in the workplace, and perhaps your employer is unaware or isn't very well educated, we can also help with corporates to support you to stay in the workplace. We have a corporate membership that women can get support with. But looking back along my entire fertility journey, I think it all comes down to education. I think the more we learn about it at school, the more doctors are taught it at medical school, the more workplaces are educated and supported, and that men are part of this conversation. I think by being open about these sorts of things, we're breaking down taboos, getting rid of the embarrassment factor and just normalizing this conversation like you are. A few years ago, nobody would ever dream of mentioning the word period. So we've come a long way.
We definitely have come a long way. Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you for sharing your story, for being so open and honest. All the links will be in the show notes, so please check out the Latte Lounge. And thank you again.
Oh, thank you for having me and for all that you do too.
For more inspiring conversations, head over to periodstorypod.com, where we have so many more for you to peruse. If you want help with your menstrual or hormone health, email me on hello@eatlovemove.com to set up a free 30-minute hormone health review. If you like today's show, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Tag us, come say hi, and send in your requests for who you'd like to see on the show on Instagram and Twitter on @periodstorypod, or email us at hello@periodstorypod.com. I'm Lenny's Brothers, and you've been listening to Period Story. Thank you so much for listening.